Well, according to this, I've gone live. So, um, hello, and it's me. I'll just go to the first item we wanted to talk about today. Was my questions, which I've raised, which I'd be interested to know about, Mike, because as I say, I was a fan of your stuff on Facebook, on YouTube, sorry, before we started talking, and I wondered how you got into homelessness because you're not a lawyer by background like me, and that's how I drifted into it. But you obviously ended up in a similar place to me, which is wanting to put out these videos, which you've done much better than me on YouTube. What? Tell me if you could how you came to what your path to this place was.
Quite a long and winding one, but I'll keep it short. So, um, back in 2005, I went to uni. I did civil engineering and I hated it, so I kind of dropped out of uni, and just kind of drifted around for a couple of years, just kind of doing different jobs and stuff. And I just knew someone, for like family friend almost, who kind of was involved in a local homelessness project. And I just went, she sort of said, go down and see see what it's about. Go down to the soup kitchen. So there was a soup kitchen every Friday night, just in this kind of guild house. And I went down there and I really liked it. Basically, there'd probably be like 50, 60 people coming every week. And from there, I worked for a religious organisation, like the night shelter. At the time, I was a churchgoer. And then spent 6 years working the night shelter, which during all of that time, I knew nothing about homelessness law. So literally, I mean, I was managing the night shelter. I was kind of involved in the rough sleeper outreach. We were like doing a good job with rough sleep accounts, stuff like that. And there was forms we had to do for the council. You had to ask questions like, "Are they statutory homeless?" And I wouldn't have a clue what that meant, and had no. I don't think I'd even know what the local authority was, what it did, we got money from them. That's about all I knew. So then I went to work in Bedford Borough Council, and that's a whole other story. But just kind of saw firsthand how pretty outrageous the culture is. Certainly was there at the time. So I ended up whistleblowing there, and it was so basically I whistle blew, and my identity was disclosed, which was kind of predictable. So I went off sick for I kind of handed my notice in and went off sick for the last 3 months. And it was whilst I was off sick that I got like an old housing allocations textbook for like a couple of quid off Amazon, and I just read it from cover to cover. So literally, reading the bits about intentional homelessness, where actually there's a duty to house people who are intentionally homeless if they're in priority need. It was just kind of blowing my mind a bit, and so from that, my old colleagues would refer people to me, and so we kind of, myself and a friend of mine, John Allen, we started doing casework essentially, like kind of not knowing what we were getting into and not really not knowing how, not knowing there were lawyers out there really. It's really weird because there's nothing local in Bedford at all that's kind of, we've got Luton Law Centre, which is our closest legal centre, but I've never met anyone who's actually engaged with them. So it's yeah, kind of just making it up as we went along, or kind of reinventing the wheel, I guess, doing stuff which you would do every day, and think nothing of, and we were kind of thinking we're pioneering it really. So we kind of got some really good compensation kind of claims in, and got some people housed, and from that it just all kind of came from that really. So in one sense, we started delivering training back in 2017, I think it was, and all we were doing was just covering the material that we were using every day. So we had a really good course. We still deliver it now. And so, and from that, kind of the YouTube videos was an extension of it. But really, it's an interesting one because I always thought it was going to be for other professionals. They'd be the ones who are most interested, other lay people, basically. So that's who it was really. That's who I was trying to aim it at. But realistically, on YouTube, the people who are most interested or care most about it is obviously people who are actually homeless themselves. So we get comments coming in, and kind of questions coming in that I don't have the time to do much with really. I haven't really figured out what to do about that yet. But that's kind of, that's the very short version of how I kind of ended
Hmm.
up in this place.
So one question there is when you start doing the training. I mean, who was it, and is it that you're training when you do the stuff? Is it people who were like you were when you started, or is it people in the
Yeah, I mean
or,
that, that's the kind of group of people who first came to it. So we kind of we were well known in Bedford in terms of, we had good relationships with a lot of services, and so we really just started delivering it to them to start off with, mostly voluntary sector initially, and then things like local drug and alcohol service would kind of get people along, and we kind of went from there. So it got to the stage. I remember one training in particular back in, it was about a few months before COVID hit, and we had about 6 counsellors in the room. We had like the head of housing at Bedford Borough Council there, and just delivered the training as we normally did. So we're quite controversial in it in terms of we don't just kind of just do dry stuff. We talk about the ethics of it really, and from that we ended up training pretty much the whole housing team in Bedford. And now it's just kind of people come from all over. So particularly, I mean, for us, COVID was useful in the sense that we now train. We regularly train people from the 4 corners of England and people that we wouldn't be able to reach otherwise. And then we do face to face as well. So I was down at a council down in the southwest not too long ago, going back there again in a couple of weeks just to kind of do some follow up. So yeah, it's mostly the workers who get the most out of it tend to be frontline. The managers don't tend to attend, which is an interesting one. We often have managers sending their frontline staff, and we'll be telling the frontline staff, "Hey, gatekeeping's a scandal. It's not ethical. You need to do something about it." And they kind of go back to their bosses, and their bosses don't really understand any of it, so they kind of, I think, sort of dampen it down a little bit. So that's another issue we're trying to work out how to get around. But yeah, so now I mean, literally, I don't know who we haven't trained really. Social workers, police officers, IDVAs. We do like bespoke IDVA training. Obviously like street outreach teams, mental health teams, drug and alcohol teams. Antisocial behaviour officers at the council. Random people, basically. A real wide bunch of wide range of people, I guess.
And do they sort of come to you and say, "Can you tell us more?" And then you say, "We do this training," or?
Yeah, well, so people. I mean, the what we found is that with Facebook, kind of just putting an event on Facebook will be enough to fill a room, basically. So people, just the way, the magic of Facebook, I guess, it just gets around. So that's generally the first contact we have with people, is they come on a day's training, and then some of them will stay kind of and continue being involved in the Facebook group. And other people will. It's not very often, I have to say, like, in terms of the number of people we train, maybe like, less than 5% probably obviously take a real interest in it. So they're like, okay, I've got some clients, they'll talk about clients in the day and that they're dealing with, and they'll be kind of outraged by it and they'll be provoked by it. And I think we'll kind of do some ongoing stuff with them. So with them, I've kind of got 2 hats. I've got the Just Us hat, which is kind of casework now, and Homelessness Best Practice, which is the kind of training and the consultancy stuff. So we're basically going to be, we're doing case management in effect. So we kind of work with organisations who want to see the change in their area, because I think the stats in Bedford is quite remarkable in terms of how much things have changed since we started back in 2013, 2014. And so I think other services, other areas see similar problems to what we did and want to know what they can do about it. And I think we can kind of, the bit we do is we kind of say, well, look, this is what worked for us and this is what didn't work for us, and this is how you involve politicians, and this is the kind of battles you're going to have, and just the kind of real range of stuff. So ranging from the nuts and bolts of what's the definition of priority need, through to the realities of making a complaint and knowing that the first stage won't be upheld. That's almost like a given, is that the first stage will never be upheld, and so that's when most people give up. So the case is, okay, what are you going to do about that? So there's kind of that angle as well. So that's training is where we meet people, and then, as I say, we get to know certain teams, certain areas quite well. So it's quite random. So we've got some good contacts up in the north. Once again, I went name, but yes, I think is that me ringing or you?
No, it's me. I'm sorry. I will shut that down. Yes. So the thing that's really interesting to me about hearing that is that, as a lawyer, I tend to think that lawyers are the only people that are sort of involved in the struggle on this. And I'm thinking, how could you take on this sort of bureaucratic machine without using legal procedures? And so it's really interesting to hear that it can be done. And also, you're looking at it from a whole different but very useful point of view, like making complaints. For lawyers, we never bother making complaints because we think, what's the point? Because by the time they've done the complaint, the problem is, it'll take them too long to deal with it to get an immediate solution. And there's a little bit with, I can't help but think this with lawyers cynically, that lawyers don't necessarily want to solve the bigger problems because it's a dollar in their pocket if the problems continue on a wider level. So you think, well, I'll just put this fire out, and I'm not going to bother telling them how to do their job properly. But what you're doing is actually raising standards in a different way, which is really encouraging.
Yeah,
But I guess the two go together, because there must be times when you realise that the people that the sort of managers and the people who have that attitude, they know what they're supposed to do, but they just don't want to do it because that would mean using resources up. Because we always had all those long. I mean, it doesn't tend to happen so much now, but those incredibly long and stupid arguments about priority need that you think, well, they know, they must recognise this person's not in priority, but they're just not going to back down. But anyway, and that's really interesting. And then my supplementary question that goes with that is, I guess we've sort of covered it. I mean, who do you think is actually watching the videos? Do you think that mostly the videos that you put out are watched by people who are actually service users, and that's
yeah.
and you get feedback from them on the comments and things, mainly sort of indicating that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is that so few people. I think we forget how many people are out there who just don't have access to any sort of service at all. So, I've got someone at the moment who's got connections with Wokingham, and I don't know what it was. I had to look on the map where it was, but kind of so I rang up Wokingham CAB and I woke up Wokingham, some other services which are on Google, and there was nothing at all in terms of any sort of law centre at all. So I was kind of saying, well, what happens if someone's rough sleeping? And they're like, oh well, they go to the council, and I'm like, okay, but what if the council say no? And there wasn't really an answer for it. So I think we kind of forget. There's a lot of people. I think one of the most recent comments I saw was someone who had a blind friend, and they were sort of saying, are they going to be in priority need or not? And so obviously they'd done their research. They kind of had a look on, kind of found out enough to kind of figure out what was needed and what kind of questions would be asked. And so there's just a lot of people out there who are desperate and
Hmm.
don't even know what there's just not enough capacity and services to actually even come close to meeting the need. So I think for a lot of people, they really are on their own. There is nothing out there at all.
Yeah,
Um,
maybe it does make it do. I mean, it enables them to sort of write a letter saying I'm in priority need because they've read what you've put. Okay, I think that's that one. All on that one then, and then the other thing we were talking about was the housing, not the housing health and safety rating system. That's coming later, but the transport. Hang on, let me get the full title. The how what here
it's
it
the
must.
home to school travel and transport guidance.
Yes,
That's
the
the title.
home to school travel and transport guidance. Do you want to? Because you raised that. Would you
Yeah,
introduce it?
yeah. So it came off the back of something you said in the last one we did. So you kind of mentioned there's guidance out there, and I never thought to even have a look at it. So I got on Google and kind of did the usual, like not even know what to write. But then I found this, and I was hoping it was going to be a real treasure trove, and it's not. But there are
Yeah,
some
I
things in
agree.
there which are quite useful. Yeah, I mean, I was kind of obviously it's not specific to kind of situations we're dealing with around people being in temporary accommodation and being moved around, and it was kind of on the back of the YR case where she was moved out. Her and her kids were moved out to Gravesend from wherever it was, Lambeth or something,
Yeah.
and kind of the argument was won there essentially because the local authority never assessed the impacts on the kids and anything really. So yeah, I mean, I'll kind of start. I mean, it wasn't rich pickings, but what I did find was probably going to be useful, and it left me with a question which I don't know if we can try and figure out between us. Um, but essentially, it's like 30 pages or so it's not massive. But essentially, one of the things it talks about is the fact that that the government or the Department of Education consider that it is reasonable for a primary school age child to spend 45 minutes travelling to and from school, as in each way, and for a secondary school pupil, it's reasonable for the journey to be 75 minutes. But there's other kind of like considerations within that. So, for example, if it's like a dangerous route, or if there's if the child's got additional needs or whatever, then that would obviously be kind of looked at differently. and it talks about the fact that in London you've got free bus passes for all kids, whereas other areas of the country you definitely don't have that. So there's kind of some figures it puts in there around kind of 2 miles and 6 miles and kind of these various sort of thresholds. But the question I didn't get from reading it, or the gap in my knowledge still is that, and I'll kind of tie in a case I'm dealing with at the moment just to kind of illustrate this. So I'm working with someone. They've approached Bedford Borough Council. They've been housed in a different town, which they've never been in before. So they were literally housed in the summer holidays and told, here it is. And they were like, well, what do we do about schools? Do we register with schools? And they said, yeah, register with schools. So they registered the kids with schools. They got the kids into schools. And then this autumn, they were affected by really bad damp. So horrendous sort of stuff, usual thing, sending photos to the mayor and stuff and saying, can we get this family moved, please? So they got moved across. It's quite a large town they've been moved to, and they've been moved to the other side of town now. And this family have been homeless for years. They've been in temporary accommodation units and kind of really really bad situation for a long time. And so the kids, particularly the younger kids, have been in lots of different schools. And so the mother's like, well, look, I don't want to change the schools again. It's ridiculous. I want to keep. They're now in this school. We had to fight to get them in, and now they're in there, and I don't want to have to change them again. And so she's got, this has all happened before Christmas. So she's gone to the school, and effectively, at the moment, the school has paid for a couple of weeks for taxi fares to get the kids to from the new address to the existing school. But they've said, this is short term. And so really what I was hoping to get out of this guidance is a bit more about, okay, how does it actually work? And it seemed to suggest to me that in that situation, then, because there's been like a sudden move, then it would be reasonable for the child to continue in the same school for the rest of the year. And then I guess the assumption is that they then move schools. But I don't know. I don't know if I'm not quite sure if you picked up more than I did from it, but that was kind of, that was it's useful to hear that kind of 45 and 75 minute total, because I'm sure, I'm sure in many cases that it's kind of people have been moved further than that away. But I guess the question for me in the YR case is, why presumably the council were not at liberty to tell the family to change schools, because they didn't. That's not their line of argument. So my question is where do we find more information about that, really? So over to you, Will, because I don't know.
Before you mentioned this guidance, I had heard about it, and I'd been meaning for ages to look into it more. So this was a good opportunity for me. But I don't know about. My initial feeling was a sort of disappointment that this was I thought maybe it was a bit of a red herring, because it seemed to be more about creating an environmentally driven policy about reducing the amount people were travelling so the air was cleaner. And there's reference to that in the guidance. And then I was a bit worried as well that it seemed to be creating what legally is known as a target duty, rather than a duty giving rise to specific rights for individuals. So they say there's a duty to promote good transport or good education access, but that's a duty to everyone, and it doesn't actually come down to saying, well, you can enforce that. And that there was a lot of argument in the old days about the Children Act, Section 17 of the Children Act, that was supposed to be about promoting the well-being of children in the area. So you say, well, that's just a general target duty. It doesn't mean that you've got to actually promote. But it was found that it does actually give rise to entitlement. Now, what I was figuring out as well, my questions under this, I mean, there did seem to be a definite entitlement to assistance, which was encouraging, where they actually have to provide assistance with transport, and that could be the transport itself or meeting the costs of the transport. And I did make some notes on that, but the questions I couldn't quite, and what I'll try and do is I'll try and write out my notes in a sort of blog post or something, so that anyone who's listening to this can go back and make sense of it, and it'll help me make sense of it. But I couldn't figure out when the local authority was liable, and this may go back to the initial question, which was on the Facebook group that you put there. Is it the local authority that is responsible for the area where the family are living? And that's difficult if that's not the same authority as the one that put them there. So that if authority A puts family in area B, does that mean that area B becomes responsible, the local authority in area B becomes responsible for providing the support, which doesn't seem to make sense because then area A would have an incentive to put everyone in a different authority. And then the other question is it the area where the school is rather than where you live? And I couldn't see anything indicating that because it seems a lot of it was to do with the school. But then I thought I'll have a look at what local authorities have come up with, because one of the things the guidance says is that everyone has to publish a sort of manifesto for how they deal with this, or a guide. And I'll just take you through to the. I will change screen so that you can see. Let me see. Oh, maybe I can't actually. Hang on, because I went to the Islington one, and I'll just take you to that. See if I can. Hang on, me and my screen. Yes, here's the one for Islington Council. In fact, hang on, but let's bring you into that as well. I'll put you there so we can both see it. But what Islington says is, I've highlighted it here in grey, and I'll just read it out because I just think you can read it on the screen there if you're watching the video. It says, the law says that the local authority must provide such free home to school travel arrangements, I think it should say as they consider necessary, to facilitate the attendance at school of eligible children, and there's the magic words, resident in their area. So
Yep.
That answers the question that it's a residential point, but then it doesn't get us around that problem of what happens if it's the authority isn't the same one that put them there. And you may say, well, in a homelessness context, it's not actually the issue. The issue is suitability. But it doesn't. You did ask the question of how long can accommodation be provided, or sorry, support be provided. And I guess
Yeah.
the question, just to go back to your scenario, how far away? What's the distance between the school and the home where they're living?
So I don't know the town, but I know how big the town is. So I'm going to guess it's probably something like 5 miles, and apparently it's kind of it's at least two changes on the bus, and because it's outside of London, buses don't come every 5 minutes, unfortunately. So it's kind of the reality is that that would take, I don't know, it would take significant time, and I think certainly one of the kids is kind of, that's going to be a real struggle for them to do on their own, because that's another issue with it, is that in one sense, it would probably be doable if all the kids had been able to get into the same school, but they weren't. So there's kind of that, the mum's having to be in two places at once, or at least two places at once. So it's kind of, it's just genuinely not workable. It's just not been possible. I mean, and I think at this point, it kind of makes me think of a few previous cases I've been involved in. One was where the child went to a special school in Bedford, and the family fled to another area, and Bedford Borough Council paid for transport to and from, taxi to and from the other town, which is probably an hour away, I guess, so that the child could remain in that school environment. And I don't know whether that was because, well, I'm going to guess it was because the child's disability meant that it was particularly important that they remained at that school. Another case I remember was where it involved Aylesbury, and Aylesbury was shipping a kid to and from school to Bedford, for a long period of time. So I was quite surprised that they were actually doing that. But they were, obviously paying, I would imagine a taxi boat, it's going to be 50 quid a pop. I'd have thought something like that for an hour's journey or something. So it's just, I don't know. I guess it's interesting you kind of say that actually every council is going to have a policy. I probably just need to get the policy and kind of have a look at it, and just see if it gives anything more to it, and whether there might be some other statutory guidance which fills in the gaps that we don't have.
What I was thinking was in your cases, that the two cases you just mentioned where the child was getting a taxi paid, was the sort of medium to long term objective to get the child back into the Bedford area, even though they're at risk of violence, say at that particular address, and so this was only a temporary measure because presumably it's not going to be a long term solution. I'm going to say, well, we'll pay for the rest of your
yeah.
education.
So one involved violence where where we knew the family weren't going to return to Bedford. So yeah. But you know, certainly whilst the family were in temporary accommodation, which was around about a year, um, the school transport continued. Um, I have to say they've now been properly housed in another town, and I actually don't know what the school arrangements are now. Probably need to find that out.
Yeah,
But yes, there was no argument at all. There was no kind of having to fight for it whatsoever. The school transport just said, yeah, that's what we're gonna do. We're gonna pick up that cost. And it's a bit different with this current case I'm working with because, as far as I know, I don't think any of the children have any kind of uh, clear disabilities. They've had a rough time because they've not had a home for many years. But um, I don't think there's that indication. So within this guidance, it talks about this kind of the kind of closest suitable school, and it seems to infer to me that the expectation within the guidance is that at some point you are going to move schools. What I couldn't see is this time limit. You know,
yeah,
so in one sense, what do I go back to the mother and say? Do I say, you know, it's that town's council that deals with you? Is it the school that deals with you, or is it
yeah, yeah.
it's
I
I don't know
think
really.
I think where the law is unclear on this, the answer to the question is why not ask all of them? Um, and because I had this years ago in a Children Act case where there was a family that were owed a due. I think they were intentionally homeless, and no local authority would house them under Part 7. So the question would be which local authority owed them a duty under the Children Act. And the family were living in, I think they were living in Lambeth, in temporary accommodation provided by Hammersmith and Fulham, and the children attended school in Wandsworth. And the definition or the legal trigger in the Children Act is very vague. It says they have a duty to children in their area.
Yeah,
And so you could be in their area. I mean, arguably, the children were in all three areas for some of the time because they weren't in the area of Hammersmith and Fulham unless the parents took them to the council to talk about their application. But they lived in one area, they were housed in another. So rather than gamble on taking judicial review proceedings against the wrong council, we just judicially reviewed all three of them. And I can't remember what the outcome was in that, but it was the one I least expected it to be that was liable. I thought that the authority that had put them in, that Hammersmith and Fulham as the placing authority, would be responsible. But technically, they weren't in the borough anymore, so it was either of Wandsworth or Lambeth. And I think with the school one, it's the same thing. If it just says there's a duty to children, unless I think Islington, when they chose resident in their area, I don't know if they just put that in there because they made a mistake or whether they've seen something that I didn't see. And bear in mind, there is a whole load of behind the guidance. There's the actual Act itself, the Education Act, which sets out more clear stuff. But I had a look at that and I couldn't see any specific wording in there for
yeah,
answering those. But just to go back to Phil, and I can sort of get us to the YR case as well in this. That could I just recap on the relevance of education to suitability traditionally, or where we were at, and where I think we're going with this, and where this is actually quite useful, which is traditionally I think the approach taken by the courts towards whether the sorry, I'll just put this back on there. So it's whether education was relevant was that it wasn't relevant. If you were homeless, you should be grateful for whatever you got, and if your children should change schools, even if that meant, well, if you were put in a temporary accommodation for 3 months, you should change schools and then change again every time you got rehoused. And the only proviso to that was that if you were doing important exams that year, there would be an argument to say that that would be an unreasonable disruption. And that all changed over the last 10 years or so with a greater awareness of the rights of children, or the importance of safeguarding the well-being of children, and the Children Act 2004, which creates that specific duty to have regard to the well-being of children. And that was something that was considered in YR. And I looked at, when I was looking at this, I did a sort of search for words in the YR judgment to see if the guidance that we're talking about came up, and it wasn't mentioned at all in there. But what you do see at paragraph 47 of the YR judgment is consideration of disruption of education as an issue of suitability. And what it says is that when contemplating the transfer of school-aged children into temporary accommodation out of the borough, Section 11 of the Children Act, read with Article 2 of the Homelessness Order and Code of Guidance, and remember that homelessness order is the one about suitability, which I'll put a link to on the blog. But that says that you should minimise that when considering suitability, local authorities should seek to minimise the disruption to education of children. And so that's much stronger than just have they got an exam coming up? If not, they can basically change schools every 3 months. And it says it should seek to minimise the disruption to the education of children and young people, particularly, but not solely at critical points of their education, such as leading up to taking GCSE or equivalent examinations. And so they should liaise with the receiving authority and make every available effort to ensure that arrangements are or will be put in place to meet the child's educational needs. And the question then I think the main takeaway point from the guidance that we started talking about is the one you've mentioned, which is paragraph 34 of the guidance, that says that the maximum school journey should be 45 minutes each way for a primary school and 75 minutes for secondary school. So I think if you merged all those together into an argument and said, well, here we've got, as in the YR case, you could have said, well, we've got an hour and a half each way, at least. And again, it doesn't come down to sort of, aha, we've got you, it's an hour and a half. It's a question of, well, did you consider that? And did you liaise with the local authority there to find out what schools are available? And the answer is almost likely certain to be no. And so you're moving towards getting them there. So I think that's it's useful, isn't it? Because it does give some more detail as to what is disruption, and it is guidance that local authorities have to have regard to. Not necessarily in a housing context, but I would have thought it's difficult once they know about it to say, well, we don't have to think about that.
And so my experience, although it's limited on this issue, like I remember a few years ago now, again before COVID, and a really terrifying case in the sense that there have been huge amounts of resistance. There was two of the kids in the family had autism, and that affected their ability to get on the bus and stuff like that. And the council have been outrageous, really petty and just kind of difficult. And the thing that saved it in the end was, they wanted the council wanted to move this family away from their existing support network. So they had the extended family coming over every day and kind of all that sort of stuff. And the mum was like, I really need that. And Beth, the council were just like, well, we don't care. We're just going to stick you on the other side of town. And the thing that saved it was the fact that the kids needed to stay in the school. That was kind of recognised by the school. And the housing team said, well, school transport will pay for it. That's fine. They'll just do it. And school transport said, no, we won't. We're not going to do that. That's not in the interest of the kids. And that was the thing that actually basically, got the offer withdrawn, and they made a different offer, which was much more suitable. So I got the sense, certainly with the officers I spoke to in the school transport team, they seemed to care about the needs of the kids, and they seemed to be, for the kids. So I think they were useful allies there, even though I was not in any way expecting that to be the outcome of the case. They really kind of came out and kind of helped kind of solve this issue, because essentially what was going to happen was the mother was going to refuse it, and the council were going to say, well, we've discharged our duty, then that's the end of it. Again, I think it's probably something that would be good to know a bit more about, really, even if it's just those gaps we've got. It made me think, you just kind of mentioned that kind of that residence test. It's also this, yes, in the same way for adult social care, it's a different test from local connection. So it's they're this ordinary
Yeah,
residents
yeah,
rather than
yeah,
actually. So you have kind of some quite weird situations caused by that where someone's got a local connection to an area, because of family connection or because they lived there before, and but the social care, they'll say, well, we don't have a referral from you until they're actually got their feet in the borough, which is quite unhelpful, really. But
yeah, yeah.
um,
And the
yeah,
opposite used to be true with children acts, as if you were put in Borough A and you were getting support out from Children's Services and other support services, as soon as you got moved into different accommodation, they'd all say, "Oh, sorry, we have to close our file now because you're outside our area," which is infuriating. Um,
I've
but
I've got a question for you, Will. Like this is going off totally off piece. I just want to get your initial thoughts, and it might not be something you've got any strong opinions on because it's not housing law, but it involves a housing law case. I've got the response from the council yesterday, and it's something I've been chasing for years. And essentially what happened was individual was about as vulnerable as you could possibly be, and they were put into temporary accommodation in the town, which the police, at the point of being placed there, the police said, this property's being cuckooed. We're very concerned about this. And so the council knew from day one. Within a couple of days, the individual was ringing the council up saying, I can't stay here. And until now, I've thought the council did nothing at all about it because when the subject access request came back, there was nothing in there. But they've managed to dig out this additional file from safeguarding, which I need to find out more about anyway. But what their position is that what they're saying is, they say the safeguarding alert was raised, so they kept the individual in this temporary accommodation block, which they were getting continued concerns about cuckooing and kind of abuse going on there. And the safeguarding team effectively met with them once, and they said, "Yeah, I'm really scared here." And then the only other thing they did was leave a message on their answer phone. And because they didn't respond to the message, they said, "Well, we've done our job. We're safeguarding investigation over." And that's literally the council's current position: is we didn't do anything wrong. We did enough. We say we followed the right procedure, and we discharged them because they didn't engage. And it was because they didn't engage that we didn't we didn't have to do anything. But my argument would be is, whilst the safeguarding investigation is going on, surely they just must simply have just had to have moved them from, if the
yeah,
housing team know that they're at risk. All the evidence that they're gathering as it goes, there's that they're even more risk now, and the housing team are literally saying, well, the safeguarding team did their investigation. That's we're
with
going to
a,
shrug it
yeah,
off.
sort of passing the buck to them, or
Yeah,
relying or hiding behind them. But yeah, I would have
yeah,
thought that if you had somebody who was arguably at risk there or in danger, then the duty would be to provide them with suitable alternative accommodation. I suppose the council could say, well, I mean, it depends on how much evidence there was, but if they say, well, we don't really believe you, we want to investigate it, and we don't think you've crossed the threshold where there's enough to give us reason to believe this. But then I think if you had lots of evidence or enough to get over that threshold, you could take them to court and say they are homeless. You failed to provide suitable temporary accommodation. I'm never quite sure of the legal status of safeguarding because that doesn't. It's not part of the duties under Part 7 to carry out a safeguarding assessment. What they have a duty there to decide is whether the person's homeless, and reasonableness to continue to occupy and threat of violence is part of that. Um,
yeah,
so it's always worrying when there's an extra layer of people involved because then you've got somebody else saying, "Oh, it's not my job to look into that; it's theirs, and they've done it." And then they might be looking at it from a different set of questions rather than the simple ones that housing have got to answer.
yeah.
So I think you could challenge that definitely.
Yeah, is another interesting thing will be is that this is going back to 2018 when this failure happened, but this is literally the first time it's been raised because even though they supposedly gave us all the records some time ago, that this was not in there for sure. So I don't really know how the LJ would take it. I don't know really. I mean it was quite deflating basically. In terms of the fact that they were even willing to kind of pretend that that was all right. But yeah. Anyway,
Yeah.
sorry. Yeah, going off on a
I'll
tangent
tell you
there.
what, if I can ask you a question as well, one we haven't mentioned before, but you've talked before about the importance of subject access requests and data protection. And I wondered if you had thoughts on this, because I've been having trouble with a local authority, and I won't name them, but they've been responding to requests for documents. So if I ask for a homelessness review and I ask for documents, normally what they should do is give me a copy of the file and then let me make representations when I've got those. Or in other cases, I might say, could you send me a copy of the latest personal housing plan? Which you would expect. They've got it on the system. They can just send it with an email. I give them authorization, so it's not like I'm just sort of ringing up as a stranger. But I get these responses saying, "Oh, you need to address your query to the or request to the Freedom of Information team and make a subject access request." And my view is that that's just being unnecessarily difficult, because I haven't asked for the whole file, and they know that it takes a month and I've got to jump through hoops. And it seems just like they're using it in a negative way. I don't know if you've come across.
Yeah, I've got quite a lot to say about subject access requests at the moment. So one of the reasons I love data protection in general is it's the last line of defence to hold organisations to account. There's no one else can do it. And actually, a subject access request is usually enough to actually hold, to do quite a long, go a long way to hold a council to account or whoever. So and because I worked in Bedford Borough Council where they've openly falsified records, so I'm very suspicious of them. So I would always, I don't think I've ever actually asked for someone's records without making a subject access request, even though it does take longer. And actually,
Mm,
these days, never mind what the legal limit is, they'll quite often. I just dealt with another council I heard back from today. They're like, well, yeah, we missed the deadline, but so what? And so, yeah, I think I would always go with the subject access request. And I appreciate you've got that. You might be kind of in a time sensitive situation. But for me, the subject access request, you can really dig down deep and see what
yeah,
they're
yeah.
laying out in a way that Housing File or a PHP wouldn't. So I would always say get the full
No, well, I would
records.
do that. I mean, I always ask for the file, but I'm conscious of the fact that they take a month to send it, and they usually treat the month as the target date rather than the sort of deadline. And so they would enjoy saying, well, you can't have it for a month. But I suppose all I can do in that situation is say to them, I'm going to proceed on the basis that what I think, the worst case scenario that I think is actually what's happening. And if you've got documents that show the opposite, let me know. But otherwise, I'm going to court. And if you produce the documents at court, I'll ask for costs because you should have given them to me when I asked for them.
Yeah.
So
So
that's, yeah, thank you for that.
I mean, and this is again, this is where we're always seen as troublemakers, and we're like, we're not solicitors. So I think for us to ask for a housing file, I think they generally as difficult as they can be sometimes. So I think it might be different for you, or kind of for kind of a more formal role where actually there would be an expectation that they should just provide it. And in one sense, I would then say, well, if you've made a reasonable request and it's important, and they're not providing it and they're making you go through the subject access request, then I'll just complain, because it's going to
I'm
land on
going
the
to do that because I think it's just unhelpful, because I can't see there isn't a rule of a legal rule that says documents can only be disclosed via subject access request.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So that's my other question. And there's one other subject I thought I just mention at the because I think we're getting towards the end now. We've been going for an hour or so. Was I've been I don't know if you saw it. I'll just mention it to start with. I'll just show this on here. If I go to allocations policies, I put a link on a list on my blog or on the resources section. I'll put it here. You can see it. I put a list of all of the councils. Oh, yeah, and you know about this because you pointed out Bedford. I'd got Bedford wrong, I think. But this is all of the allocation policy documents, so that if you ever want to find out what the allocation, this is just for dealing with housing register and social housing applications, you can go to, I think most local authorities are here for London, and then you click on that and it'll bring up the allocation policy. And I had an idea of making a similar list. I'm going to do another one for the temporary accommodation placement policies.
So on that one, Will. You sent some stuff over. One was for Bedford Borough, one was for Central Beds, but
Yeah.
I don't think Bedford has that policy, which is interesting. I want to find out more about that because that's
Well, they should. They're supposed to have if they are a housing authority, and they're going
Where
to
does
be.
it say they should? Is it? Is there something I can
Let me
waiver
think.
say-
Where does it say that everyone? Oh, I don't think there's a law that says every local authority must have one. But in the case of Nasola Mesu, Baroness Hale, when considering the suitability to how the local authority behaved, said, well, if you're going to set up procedures, because the problem with providing local was temporary accommodation is always a question of, well, should you say to them, well, you've asked us for accommodation at 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. All we've got is this one place, and it's in Skegness or somewhere, and you have to get the train all the way there. Or should you wait until tomorrow when there might be some more places? And the argument was all this should be set out in the placement policy document. And Baroness Hale said you're not going to have a very good management system if you don't have that. And I think that's where it came from. And the argument would be that local authorities that didn't have one would be in trouble if they came to be seeking to justify how they'd made an offer. Because the danger was otherwise it's just sort of spin the bottle. It's just what have we got today without any consideration of the needs of the family or whatever. So that's where that comes from. But what I thought, I've put this other link on the thing to just the website, because most of these authorities, when I was doing the search, have a web page which deals with their housing situation. And I think it would be very useful for people to know what's there, because some of them are really, really good. Like, I think Haringey, I'll come back to this. Haringey was one of the best because it was simple, but it had a sort of just a link to an email address which you can email, and then they'll acknowledge your request for help. But I've noticed a couple of sort of slightly sinister ones, and I spent about an hour today looking at Bromley's form, and a similar amount of time with Wandsworth's. Because what they do is they put incredibly detailed database forms on. So it says make a homeless application, and you go in there and they ask you like everything about yourself, like your national insurance number, what school your children go to, all the things that the caseworker would ask you. Even you have to list what medication you're on if you've got a medical condition. And you know how it is with computers, that it won't let you go on to the next question until you've filled all that in. And so it actually becomes an impossible task to make the application for many people, because I'd have thought unless you have all of this information available, and you're very good with dealing with these things, let's put it this way, the most vulnerable people are not going to be able to assess themselves online. But I thought it'd be quite good. I mean, there's a lot to do, but maybe in the future we could review different local authorities' online homelessness facilities, because some, as I say, are really good, and others are worrying. And I think each of them should have a basic email address where you just say, help, I need help, can you get back to me? And then somebody will assess you. And most of them don't do that. Obviously, some local authorities, I think which one was it? It was Lambeth Council. I was trying to find a central address to report disrepair to send a pre-action letter. And the response I got from the legal department is there isn't one. You'll just have to send it in the post. But I get around that by just sending it to the people in the legal department, because they'll have to cover their backsides and make sure they've passed it on. And they're pretty helpful about that. But you'd think they would create Well, you can see why they don't do that, because they just don't want people. It's like if you look on GP websites, most of them don't give you an email address.
You have to get quite ingenious about it sometimes,
Well, I
just to
suppose, I
try and
mean,
get their
God
stuff.
knows
But
how
they do
many
have them.
emails they get that they don't want to read, but it's something I'd like to talk about. If you're interested in the future, we could have a look at some
Yeah,
of those.
I think it'd be maybe for the next time. Actually, like maybe if Haringey's got a really good one, then look through Haringey's and say, well, this is what's good about it. And then if was it Bromley you said, like it was the opposite.
Well,
Just
it
kind of
was. I mean, it
actually,
was. I don't want to be too mean on Bromley, because, but I think that somebody got carried away when they were doing the form, and they thought, hey, you know what we could do? We could outsource the whole
yeah,
homelessness inquiries process to the initial inquiry, which defeats the object of it. Um,
yeah,
but I'll, yeah, maybe put that on the list for another time. Um,
yeah, cool.
so
Yeah,
I think that's
and I think
everything.
yeah, I think that'd be good to do in a future one. And I think I said to you before about it'd be good in future to go just sort of sit down and go through the templates that Bedford Borough Council's housing officers use when they make decisions, because it's very
Oh yes,
interesting.
yes. Yeah,
Very
because
and
you mentioned you got those through a subject. Was it subject access or freedom?
eventually FOI. So my colleague Shannon, chased them up for months. But so it's what was interesting, because we got them at the same time that I got a subject access request for a client, and essentially what you could see in these emails was that the senior was coaching the frontline worker how to find them non-priority, because they'd already been found priority needs in a previous application, and they'd been rough sleeping ever since. So obviously they were not going to be any better particularly. But literally it was kind of disheartening but very interesting to see how the frontline worker was being, well, if this doesn't work, then if you find out this, then you might be able to say that they're not engaged with mental health services. They must be okay. Those kind of things are all in there. So I think it's really, going back to that question you're saying about subject access requests. The stuff you find on subject access requests is kind of really kind of shocking sometimes. And I recently made a complaint to Bedford because one, they sent the records through, and essentially they redacted it, but they hadn't done it properly. So I had like lists of other people's names in there. With the marker pen, you could still see it, which is something we've raised them before.
That's
But
another question with subject access, isn't it? Is the all the redacted stuff? Because sometimes I get these things, and I think, why have they redacted this stuff, and how will I ever know whether they were entitled to redact it? Because it could just,
well,
yeah,
I found out because I can see exactly. They haven't redacted. So I had a really big one once where the legal team obviously had the right software where they could genuinely redact it, but what the housing team were doing was basically highlighting it in black and saving it as a PDF, which means the text is still there. You just copy and paste it, and you've got it again. So there's some very fascinating stuff that came out of that as well. But ultimately, their job is to
and
with
did you
this these
find that they'd been redacting things that were just embarrassing rather than redactable?
no. No, I didn't actually at all. No, but I was actually surprised the stuff they told me. They were giving me stuff which was related to the client, but they could have quite easily not included it in there, and I would never have known. And it was quite damning. So yeah, I mean,
Hmm.
it's interesting. Is all I can
Yeah,
say,
yeah.
really. Yeah,
Okay. Well, I think that's everything for me for now. So shall I wind up for now? So thank you very much. It's been
yeah,
a pleasure again talking to you, and I will get back to you about editing this and hopefully getting it up on YouTube as a. I mean, it should be up there now as a sort of streamed document, but I think we'll need to chop it up and make it more accessible. And I might try and do a podcast version of it as well that people can just
yeah,
listen to, because I think it's doable on that level too. So
yeah,
thanks, Ben, and speak to you soon. Yeah.
yeah. Next time, thanks, Will. Yeah, and we'll get an agenda. So that's
Yeah.
cool. Nice one. Okay.
Bye.